Hello class, welcome to the History of Punk. My name is Professor Thursday, and today we're going to take a deep dive look into the world of Goth. And to begin this story, we need to go way back in time. It's August the 24th, 410 AD, and King Olderic of the Visigoths had just sacked Rome. The Roman Empire controlled most of Europe, but was in steady decline from political strife and a wavering military. The barbarian hordes were steadily encroaching from the north until the western half of the Roman Empire broke, and it wasn't pretty. What had followed was considered to be one of the darkest times of Western history. Without centralized government and technological advancement, Europe fell into the Dark Age. As the influence of the empire fell, the new art styles had developed through religious symbolism over previous classical versions of realism. In the 12th century, this art style shifted into architecture, and in particular, churches. They included bony archways and rib-inspired supports, as well as exterior buttresses and pointed arches. Cathedrals like these popped up all over Europe. But as the Renaissance came, there was a new appreciation to the classic Greek and Roman architecture. The cathedrals of old were dismissed as barbaric and Gothic, and a dismissive reference to the barbarian tribe that sacked Rome and destroyed the classical civilization. The word Gothic was then used to refer to the Dark Ages as a symbol of darkness, simplicity, and superstition. In the 18th century, there was a period of enlightenment which valued science and reason above all else. As a barbaric counter to the modern times, a few authors reflected on the darker version of Romanticism and focused on spiritual forces and idealistic natural landscapes. These authors created the literal genre of Gothic. From the late 1700s to 1970s, the term Gothic referred to the books and films that tapped into the horror-based genre. But in the 1970s, that began to include music. The horror genre, as used in music, didn't start with the British post-punk bands of the late 70s. The most direct influence would have been from British metal, but more specifically, Black Sabbath, the Rosetta Stone of metal subgenres. Before Sabbath was Alice Cooper, a shock rocker that created thematic shows of horror and grotesqueness since 1969. And before that, there was dark country, folk songs that spoke of devils and spirits. Those songs ranged further back into the earlier days of American colonialism. But for what we're looking at, 1978 seems like a good place to start. From Northampton, England came the band Bauhaus, named after the German art movement in 1919. Led by Daniel Ash, this band had a uniqueness not found in Northampton. Despite not having a true solid sound in their lineup, which ranged from new wave to ska, they were able to strike a deal with Beck Records 6 weeks after their formation. Their debut single, Bela Lugosi's Dead, was a landmark hit on the independent charts, but also marked the first song of yet to be defined goth subgenre.
White on white, translucent black capes, back on the rack. Bela Lugosi's dead, the bats have left the bell tower, the victims have been bled, red velvet lines, the black box. Bela Lugosi's dead. I'm dead.
The goth subgenre had a much earlier start with The Doors in 1967, as much of their sound had dark atmosphere both in lyrics and in live performance. It is not enough to have a dark subject matter, but an overall dread must be heard through the music. For example, Joy Division, a post-punk influencer of the goth movement, might have paved the way for Bauhaus, but they wouldn't have been considered goth. It was only after the Bela Lugosi's Dead did the term goth become a staple description to bands like Susie and the Banshees, Magazine, and Joy Division. The song pivoted bands towards the gothic sounds of tone and tempo, bands like The Cure and Susie Sue. At this point, let's talk about image. If you want me to describe goth in one sentence, I would not be able to do it justice. It goes beyond the music, the fashion, and the mindset, but it does have an overall aesthetic as, in part, with help from the UK punk scene. For example, Susie Sue of the original punkers of the UK. She has black hair and pale skin, and was the opposite of feminine beauty, considered to be blonde with tan skin. Her punk side unleashed her creative side through music and fashion, the cornerstones of the Gothic identity. The dark dirge of goth heavily implied the use and overuse of the color black. And with this, let us address what goth is not. The people that associate with goth music aren't depressed woe is me embodiments. That's more towards emo, and we'll cover that a lot later. Goths have an appreciation for dark music and subject matters. There is beauty in all things, and the goths can see beauty better in the dark. To say the 80s was a dark time is an understatement. Horror movies were on the rise throughout London in the 70s thanks to Hammer horror films. Also, the influence of doom metal and black metal in the European community was pretty high. UK's own Ozzy Osbourne was depicted as a Prince of Darkness, and there was a psychobilly punk movement that highly featured horror themes in their music. Beyond that, violence was on the rise, from the gore in the movies to the blood on the streets. Cold War politics and national politics were taking dark, scary turns. Satanism and the occult were becoming found in comic books, Dungeons & Dragons games, and musical lyrics, both forwards and backwards. So, misconception number 2. Goths are not Satanists. At least, no more or no less than anyone else. It is true that some are into paganism and or are Wiccans, but no more or no less than everybody else. In fact, Goths have their fair share of Christians, which is, of course, no more and no less than everybody else. Being a Goth did not dictate one's religious alignment. Music pertaining to Satanism, horror elements, or gore-filled themes is a result of the artistic market within a capitalistic system. If one band was different and it works, other bands will follow. This was true of metal, which was accused heavily of devil worshipping, only to find that next to no bands worshiped the devil. They just used demonic art and lyrics for the cool factor that would allow the band's albums to be bought and stand out from other albums. It is the fans that take it to the next level, and in the case of Goth, the fans use music and fashion as a form of artistic expressionism. The Goths, if anything, are artists. In no other subgenre of punk is there an over-the-top, in-your-face, aggressive, albeit passive, DIY presence within the fashion aesthetics that is known as goth. The Goths may only use black, but they use it better than anyone else. In 1982, the goth movement was strong in London, to the point where the club, the Batcave, opened up as a hub of the UK goth community. Through this community, the NME described this as the positive punk movement, as a resurgence of that punk push of 1977. Bands like the Southern Death Cult, UK Decay, Flesh for Lulu, Play Dead, Blooded Roses, Sex Gang Children, and the Virgin Prunes. They were all part of this scene. Positive punk was an ironic title for goth at the time, but was meant to infer that the punk scene was not dead, and there was warmth on the indie level that was not seen in the mainstream new wave synth pop, and not as unwelcoming as the hardcore punk that was evolving everywhere else. The major turning point for UK goth was the release of the album 1985's First, Last and Always by the Sisters of Mercy. The band had been on the scene for the past 5 years and often fought against the band being labeled as a goth band. With eternal issues amongst the bandmates and confrontation with WEA record label, the band split after a short tour in the UK. However, the band was deep in debt for producing a record, First, Last and Always, that took nearly 3 years to break even. The album went silver in '87, selling 60,000 copies, and gold, 250,000 copies, that was sold in '89. Unfortunately, by turning away their image from the goth scene and refusing to consider themselves goth music led to slow sales and poor marketing. However, the band's unintentional mark on the goth scene, as well as reviews from mainstream critics, benchmarked this album as to what goth music should sound like going forward. It could be rock and gloomy at the same time.
By the side of the ocean, headed for sunset. For the kingdom come. For the black planets. Black world. Black planets.
One of the goth genre's founding leaders, Robert Smith of The Cure, became one of the most successful goth bands of the 1980s, if not beyond. In the early 80s, The Cure started in a post-punk fashion, chasing the poppy feel of the pre-UK synthpop, but was corralled in a direction by record producers for their first album. They shifted gears to a more progressive sound when Smith had more control over the content for the next albums, aiming not to be radio-friendly, but to produce music he wanted to produce. This minimalistic progressive sound shined through on their single, A Forest. There was 2 versions of the song, the LP version of the single, which had nearly 2 more minutes of atmosphere and a gothic styling that just wouldn't fit on the album. But in 1982, The Cure switched gears to experiment in synthpop and new wave, tapping into MTV's market. They wanted to expand their audience in America by going radio-friendly. Weird, artsy music videos followed the works of Let's Go to Bed Together, The Walk, and The Love Cats. Between '83 and '88, The Cure released a series of LPs and singles that broke free of their cemented goth ties and became a familiar face of the MTV British Invasion alongside of Duran Duran and Tears for Fears. But feeling inadequate for not living up to his self-expectations, Robert Smith shed away from his pop status and returned to his goth undertones in 1989's album Disintegration. The mood of the album featured depression, panic, dread, and hopelessness. A signature goth trope of the expression, which includes all ranges of emotion that can be relatable by all, from the most optimistic to the most melancholy. Goth doesn't have to be all negative, as this album's emotional release can be good with this, especially through songs, Pictures of You, and Love Song. The crowning achievement for this album was their title track, Disintegration, which was a send-off to the fans, as Smith believed this would be his final masterpiece. The American outlook on what is to be considered goth music, as we understand it today, happens to be way before the punk movement. Lyrically, this begins in country. Most rock origins begin with country, and the last known country artist that dabbled with dark imagery and gothic themes would be Johnny Cash, beginning in the late 1950s. Ring of Fire would be one of his earliest works. In the 1970s, he rebranded himself as the Man in Black in honor of the poor, the hungry, the over-persecuted, and the betrayed. And then we had the Lizard King, Jim Morrison of The Doors, in the 1960s. He was able to produce gothic atmosphere through songs like The End and Riders of the Storm, both of which contain graphic content of sexuality and or homicide. But what about gothic imagery or fashion? Well, awkwardly enough, we had the Addams Family and the Munsters. And this is where American Gothic goes a little campy. Horror themes are fun, especially in the 1970s when horror films were pushing new boundaries. Very, very cheap, budgeted boundaries. The British had dark metal, but America's had Morticia Addams and Herman Munster. So the first American goth bands were both spooky and creepy. In 1977, the Cramps helped bring these two together and almost started the psychobilly genre. The real punk-infused movement happened to be in the late 70s as punk was beginning its transformation in LA. Bands at the time were evolving their sound into hardcore and post-punk, and from this scene came death rock. UK Gothic came directly from the post-punk scene, while American Gothic rock developed directly from punk itself, with a little bit of LA metal spliced in there. The first band on the scene was 45 Grave that came together in 79 and released their first single, Black Cross, in 81. Remembering our time frame, the UK Gothic sound hasn't really hit America yet, so the word Gothic is not used to describe this music. It was instead dubbed death rock. So, our next misconception is goth is all about death, which is understandable because many songs in the subgenre about death acknowledge death, deal with the process of death. But saying that goth is all about death, saying that rap is all about crime, or rock is all about the devil, and country music is all about pickup trucks and beer. It's just not true. But in all these examples, that doesn't seem far-fetched because of association. And Americans love the idea of death. Death rock, death metal, death row records, deathcore, death industrial, death step. It's a word to identify edgy music that's not meant to be heard by all. It shows exclusiveness and perhaps a gatekeeper fan base. It is as almost as if there's a sign that says, you must be at least this edgy to listen to this music. In the early 1980s, especially once MTV became the main influencer, UK goth began to transform elements of death rock into American goth rock. Bands like The Flesh Eaters, Super Heroines, Pompeii 99, Community, FK, and Burning Image led the short-lived death rock scene from LA. At the forefront of this charge was the band Christian Death. Their 1982 album Only Theatre of Pain is considered the first American Gothic album. The band would be plagued with breakups, reformations, and experimentations in form, but would have a lasting presence in goth music for decades to come. As we head towards the 90s, goth culture will get an upgrade. As the original bats got older, got jobs, kids, and adulting responsibilities, they never truly outgrew what many thought would be a fad. Their lifestyle created a need for a new market targeted at goth culture. Capitalism turned its focus to the gothic representation in media and fashion. The campy icons of Elvira and Alice Cooper were well-known horror icons in the 80s. Director Tim Burton brought to the big screen Beetlejuice, Edward Scissorhands, and the gothic rendition of Batman. Gothic movies like The Addams Family, The Craft, and The Crow followed soon afterwards. But through these movie hits, the mainstream public understanding of goth culture boiled down to two things: silly and sexy. The bands of the 80s had a sense of 80s fashion where hair and makeup was a common target of expressionism. And now that we're entering towards the 90s, multiple cultures are attempting to redefine one particular culture for marketability with a big sign that reads, "This is Goth." The girls had to be pale, dark hair, tight, black outfits, and busty. The males had to be mopey, death-obsessed, pale, dark hair, tall, and scrawny. They had to be overdramatic, sometimes pretentious, but lacking common wisdom. There's a couple problems with this. There are too many misconceptions about the goth culture as fabricated by the media. 2. New bats or people interested in joining the goth scene will have a misconceptions of this acceptable behavior with real goths. And 3. This leads to elitist gatekeeping to ensure that true goth clubs or scenes would not become tainted by the forced view of goths presented by the media. These issues can splinter and fragment the goth culture, music, and even fashion. As a new generation comes through, goth would change and misrepresent older, pre-established goths to the public. Stores like Spencer's Gifts and Hot Topic sold faux goth fashion and goth accessories. Media branding and fashionable looks as seen in The Matrix, Blade, Underworld, Buffy the Vampire Slayer, and The Nightmare Before Christmas were widely available for poser goths to enter the scene. Fashion sense with the pre-established goth communities began to see Victorian goths, steampunk goths, and previously mentioned cyber goths and alternative goths. At this point, we're focusing less on the music and more on the culture. Not only as a class here and now, but back then in the 90s. Music used to define the goth culture, and now it seems to be getting lost. But I do know the goth community reclaimed the scene after the mainstream goth broke away from commercialism. With the help of online communities to spread understanding and traditions, goth is in a better place than it ever has been in its whole life. Is it punk? No. Not anymore. It came from punk roots. It crawled, it walked, and then it ran. It started off as a subgenre, and now it's its own genre with many different offshoots. What we've talked about today is the basics, and I urge you to tap into the world of goth music and find something for yourself. My name is Professor Thursday, and this is the History of Punk.